Leo's GPS flickered and died with a soft chime, the screen proclaiming, "No signal," as his sedan descended deeper into the topographical depression known as Slaughter Hollow. It was a shortcut, the app had claimed, a way to shave 20 minutes off his journey to a friend's Halloween party in Lexington. The name should have been a warning, but he dismissed it as another quaint, morbid Appalachian moniker. The late afternoon sun was already a memory here, suffocated by the dense, leafless canopy of oak and hickory that clawed at the steep slopes. His headlights cut weak cones through the premature twilight, illuminating a tunnel of cracked asphalt and a carpet of wet, decaying leaves. A bank of fog, thick and white as raw wool, manifested without warning. It did not creep, it surged from the woods, flowing across the road like a tidal wave and swallowing the world beyond his windshield in an instant. Leo slammed the brakes, the anti-lock system juddering under his foot. The car slid silently to a halt, enveloped in a silent, blinding whiteness. He could see nothing but the frantic dance of dust motes in his own headlights, reflected back at him by the oppressive mist. The familiar sounds of the forest, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of squirrels, were utterly absent, replaced by a silence so profound he could hear the blood pulsing in his ears. The fog began to thin, not to reveal the modern road, but to reform the world into something else. The asphalt under his tires was now a muddy, deeply rutted track. The dense second-growth forest had been replaced by a clearing of stumps and smaller, younger trees. To his left stood a crude log cabin, its chinking fallen out in clumps, the single window a gaping, dark hole. A hand-pump well, its iron handle rusted into a single reddish-brown mass, stood sentinel beside it. The light had not returned to normal. Instead, a sickly, greenish luminescence clung to everything, as if the very air was poisoned. It was a light that revealed too much, making every splinter on the cabin logs, every pebble in the mud, appear with unnatural, cruel clarity. He saw the first one then, standing beside the path near a skeletal oak tree. It was not a wispy phantom, it was solid, horrifically tangible. It wore the rough, spun, patched trousers and coat of a 19th century farmer, but the fabric was dark and stiff with vast, old stains. Its hands, hanging limp at its sides, were the color of bruised cheese, the skin waxy and tight, with a faint, sickening shimmer of decomposition. It did not move. Its head was tilted at an angle that suggested a broken neck, and its face was hidden in the deep shadow cast by a broad, brimmed hat. It was simply there, a thing of rotten memory, planted in the earth. The figure by the tree suddenly twitched. Its head snapped upright with a sound like cracking ice. All at once, the other figures he had only half perceived in the periphery began to move. They stumbled from behind trees and out of the cabin's doorway, their motion a hideous parody of life. Their gait was a stiff, jerking shuffle, limbs moving with the rusty reluctance of forgotten machinery. They did not speak or moan. The only sounds were the wet suck of their feet in the mud, the creak of their desiccated joints, and the ragged, rhythmic rasp of air being forced through lungs that should have been dust. They were not looking at him, but they were moving toward his car. Leo fumbled for the door locks, his fingers numb and clumsy. The central locking mechanism clicked shut just as the first of them reached his car. A man in a blood-soaked wool coat walked directly into the side of the vehicle, his body thumping dully against the metal. He did not react to the obstruction but continued his forward motion, sliding along the side panel, his stiff, dead hands scraping the paint. Another, a smaller figure with long, matted hair, pressed its torso against the driver's side window. The glass groaned under the pressure. The thing's hand, gray and cracked like old pottery, smeared a trail of dark, viscous fluid as it slid down the pane. Its head turned slowly, and though its features were a blurred nightmare through the smeared filth, Leo felt its attention fix on him. The world outside erupted into a silent, rehearsed frenzy. The figures turned on one another, and on the empty air, with a sudden, explosive violence. A man was dragged from the cabin doorway by an unseen force, his body contorting as he fell to the mud. A woman-shaped thing near the well was thrown against its stones, her head snapping back with a sickening crunch. But then Leo saw the others, the ones who didn't belong. A man in a bright blue puffer jacket, his face a mask of modern terror, was on his knees, grappling with a decaying figure over a rusted rifle. A young woman in jeans and sneakers was being pulled by her hair by another specter, her mouth wide in a silent scream. They were not ghosts from the past. They were people, real people, wearing the clothes of now, trapped inside the memory of the massacre, forced to play their parts. The passenger door lock exploded inward with a sharp crack. The mechanism didn't just unlock, it shattered. The door swung open as if pulled by an immense force. The interior dome light flickered on, a pitifully small beacon in the ghastly green gloom. Standing there was the first figure he had seen, the one with the broken neck. It leaned in, the smell of wet earth, old blood, and profound rot flooding the car. It did not look at him with eyes, for there were only dark, empty sockets, but he felt its memory. A cold, singular record of pain and fury press against his mind. Its hand, cold and hard as petrified wood, shot out and closed around his forearm. The pain was immediate and deep, a cold that burned into his bone. He was pulled from the car, not with a yank, but with an inexorable, gradual drag, as if reality itself was reconfiguring to include him. The world swam, the green light intensifying, the sounds of the struggle becoming deafening, the thuds of blows, the wet tearing, the choked, gurgling final breaths. As his feet hit the mud, a wave of nausea worse than any he had ever known washed over him. He looked down, and his blue jeans and fleece jacket were gone. He was now wearing rough, blood-soaked wool and homespun. The skin on his hands was changing, bleaching to a pale, waxy gray. He felt a heavy, solid weight in his right hand. He looked. It was a wood, splitting maul, its steel head dark and wet. His own will was gone, compressed into a tiny, screaming corner of a mind that was no longer his. His body, his new, decaying body, turned with the others. He saw a man in a flannel shirt, a hiker from another time, perhaps, his face a rictus of terror, raising his hands in a futile plea. Leo's arms, powered by a memory that was centuries old, raised them all. The last thing Leo, the man from the present, truly understood was the sensation of the impact, a jarring, visceral shock that traveled up his arms, and the sight of the fresh, bright red blood splattering across the waxy, gray skin of his own hands. The memory was complete. The hollow was satisfied. For now, on the real, modern road, the fog vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Leo's car sat silent and still in the middle of the asphalt, its engine running, its headlights cutting through the normal Kentucky night. The driver's door was locked. The passenger door was wide open. The interior was empty. The only thing left behind was the faint, lingering smell of turned earth and old iron, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that the hollow was not empty. It was simply waiting for the next visitor to join its eternal, rotting remembrance. My name is Daniel. The decision to drive through rural Pennsylvania on Halloween night was born from a desire for solitude, not spectacle. My life in Pittsburgh had become a cacophony of deadlines and disappointments, a recent and bitter end to a long-term relationship leaving me raw and seeking the anonymity of empty spaces. The thought of facing another noisy, obligatory party, filled with forced laughter and costumes that hid nothing, filled me with a dull dread. I had plotted a course to visit a reclusive college friend in Maryland, deliberately choosing the winding backroads over the monotony of the interstate. My GPS, an old unit I kept as a backup, had been glitching in the mountainous terrain, rerouting me twice already, and leading me deeper into the forested hills around Bedford County. The world outside my Ford Focus had shrunk to the small island of light my headlights provided, surrounded by an ocean of absolute darkness. I passed darkened farmhouses and closed-down antique shops, their windows like dead eyes staring out from another century. I noticed, with a slight unease that I initially dismissed as city-bred paranoia, that not a single house had a pumpkin on its porch or any decoration to mark the holiday. There were no cardboard skeletons, no fake cobwebs, no orange string lights. It was as if the entire county had collectively decided to ignore the night's existence, or perhaps to barricade itself against it. The only signs of life were occasional pairs of feral eyes reflecting my headlights from the dense woods before vanishing back into the void. A low fuel warning chimed, its digital bell a stark contrast to the organic silence of the woods. I tapped the GPS screen, but the pixelated map had frozen. My car a stationary icon on a road that no longer existed in the device's memory. A sense of genuine isolation began to seep in, cold and heavy. I rounded a bend and saw the flickering neon sign of a gas station, a lone oasis of light in the vast darkness. It was an old-fashioned setup with manual pumps and a small, clapboard-sided convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. An elderly attendant with a face like a dried river took my cash without a word, his eyes avoiding mine, looking past my shoulder into the night as if expecting to see someone else there. Back in the car, as the tank filled with the smell of stale gasoline, my phone buzzed with a delayed flurry of text messages from my friend in Maryland. The final one, sent over an hour ago, read, "Heard on the scanner they still haven't found him. The harvestman, be careful out there. They say he takes people from the roads when the fog rolls in. Just urban legend stuff probably. But lock your doors." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The harvestman. The name was chillingly rustic, devoid of the theatricality of city legends. It sounded like something from a different time, a name born from the soil and the grim practicality of a farming community. I paid and drove away quickly, the attendant's silent stare burning into my back. The fog had thickened, coiling across the road in dense, phantom waves that my headlights could not penetrate. I was driving blind, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Just a few miles later, a loud pop echoed from beneath the car, followed by the violent, jarring thumping of a flat tire. I wrestled the car onto the gravel shoulder, the chassis shuddering to a halt. Stepping out into the frigid, damp air, the silence was immediate and absolute. The rear driver's side tire was utterly shredded, a long, sharp shard of dark flint embedded deep in the rubber. As I bent to inspect the damage, my phone slipped from my jacket pocket, clattering onto the wet road. I watched in horror as the screen shattered and went black, irrecoverably dead. I was stranded, completely alone, in the silent, fog-shrouded woods on a serial killer's hunting ground. Trudging up the gravel driveway was an act of pure, desperate hope. I had seen the faint, jaundiced glow of a window through the trees from the road, a pinprick of civilization in the oppressive blackness. The house at the end of the drive was a 2-story farmhouse, its white paint peeling to reveal gray, weathered wood. A porch wrapped around the front, and a single, bare bulb above the door cast a sickly light that seemed to push the darkness back only a few feet. No decorations, no welcome mat, no sign of life beyond that single bulb. I knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness like a gunshot. Moments later, the door creaked open a few inches, stopped by a tarnished brass security chain. No face appeared in the crack, only a sliver of dark interior and the smell of old wood and dust. A man's voice, low and gravelly, spoke from the darkness. "Tire go flat." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I had not mentioned my predicament. The man who introduced himself as Elias unchained the door and let me in. He was a large, broad-shouldered figure who moved with a quiet, deliberate heaviness. His flannel shirt stretched tight across his back. He had a thick, graying beard and eyes that held no light. He offered the use of his landline. "Phone's in the kitchen," he said, his tone flat. The house was a museum of neglect. The air was stale and cold, colder than it was outside. In the kitchen, I saw the phone on the counter, its cord cut clean through, the two ends splayed open to reveal colored wires. Elias followed my gaze and said, without a trace of emotion, "Mice. Always chewing on things." He gestured for me to sit at the heavy wooden table while he went to get a tool to fix the tire. The table's surface was covered in deep gouges, and near where I rested my hand, a dark, sticky patch that smelled faintly but unmistakably of copper. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of warning. Elias led me down a dark hallway to fetch a jack from a closet, his heavy footfalls the only sound. The hallway was long and lined with closed doors, but at the very end, one was slightly ajar. From within, a bright, clinical white light leaked out, starkly contrasting the home's general gloom. As we passed, my eyes adjusted, and I saw the room was not a bedroom. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were rows of glass jars, the kind used for home canning. In the fraction of a second I had to look, I saw the jars were filled with a clear, preservative liquid, and suspended within them were dark, organic shapes. One looked like a large, pale grub, another like a collection of knotted roots. A third, sitting on a workbench under the bright light of a halogen lamp, held a human hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, its skin bleached white and floating, the harvestman's grisly collection. I did not run. I did not scream. A primordial instinct for self-preservation locked my muscles and silenced my voice. To show fear was to trigger the chase. I followed Elias back to the front door, my mind screaming, every nerve ending on fire. Elias handed me a heavy, cold tire iron, his grip lingering for a moment too long, his rough skin scraping against mine. "For the lug nuts," he said, his eyes flat and dark as old well water. "They can be stubborn." As I turned to leave, my shoulder brushed against a heavy waxed canvas coat hanging on a peg by the door. Something heavy and metallic clattered to the floor from the coat pocket. It was a bone-handled hunting knife, its long, polished blade glinting in the poor light. The blade was not clean. It was streaked with rusty brown stains, and caught in the delicate join between the handle and the steel was a small, twisted piece of orange and black novelty fur, a fragment of a Halloween costume from a victim who was not from around here. I did not remember the walk back to my car. My body moved on autopilot, fueled by a terror so profound it was almost peaceful. I changed the tire with frantic, shaking hands, the cold metal of the lug nuts searing my skin, every rustle in the woods sounding like an approaching footstep. I expected a hand to land on my shoulder at any moment. I drove away, not caring about the direction, pushing the car far beyond what the foggy, winding roads would safely allow, the flat, ruined tire still rattling in my trunk. I drove until I saw the blazing lights of a 24-hour truck stop just off a highway on ramp, a blinding galaxy of fluorescence and safety. I parked among the big rigs, their massive forms like sleeping beasts, locked the doors, and finally allowed myself to tremble uncontrollably. I was safe. I had made it. In the rearview mirror, as I adjusted it to see my own pale, terrified face, I saw something lying on my back seat. It had not been there before. It was the bone-handled knife, and tucked neatly under its stained blade was a small, carefully folded square of brown parchment paper. When I unfolded it with numb, fumbling fingers, I found a single sentence written in a precise, sharp hand in what looked like dried, brown ink. "The harvest is not over." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, a living, breathing entity that had followed me, and I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that I had not escaped. I had been chosen. My flat tire was no accident. The house in the woods was not a refuge. It was the beginning. He knew my name was Daniel, and he was not done with me. The rain wasn't just falling, it was assaulting the city. On the third floor of a century, old brick walk up on Whipple Street in Logan Square, Lila tried to anchor herself with the weight of a book in her lap. It was Halloween, and though the city usually thrived on a festive, chaotic energy, tonight the storm had smothered it, leaving only the intimate, isolating drumming of water against glass. Her new apartment, a studio she'd rented for its northern light and hardwood floors, felt like a cave. The smell of fresh paint over old plaster couldn't mask the underlying scent of dust and dampness that seeped from the walls whenever it rained. Unpacked boxes formed cardboard canyon walls, their shadows shifting and deepening with every flicker of the neon sign from the music venue across the street. She pulled her wool blanket tighter, the scratchy fabric a small comfort, and read the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. The wind whipped down the alley, whistling through a gap in the window frame she hadn't yet noticed, a sound that was less like wind and more like a long, drawn-out sigh. The digital clock on her microwave, a cheap, glaring red beacon in the dimness, shifted from 11:59 to 1200 a.m., midnight, the witching hour. The phrase echoed in her mind, no longer a cliché but a tangible threshold in time. It was then that a new sound insinuated itself beneath the rain's static hiss. Creak. A pause, long enough to make her doubt her own ears. Then creak. It was the distinct, agonizing sound of weight being placed deliberately on a stressed floorboard. It came from the hallway, the building's main artery, a space she already disliked for its perpetual gloom and smell of cabbage and old wood. She sat frozen, her knuckles white where they gripped the blanket. This wasn't the random pop of settling pipes or the scurry of a neighbor's pet. This was a pattern, a slow, measured progression. Step, step, pause. Each footfall was heavier than the last, a patient, plodding approach that seemed to consume the very air in her apartment. It was moving down the hall, unmistakably, toward her door. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful stitch. Every rational explanation. A drunk neighbor, the elderly Mr. Gable from 3B Sleepwalking, a prank, evaporated under the sheer, visceral weight of the sound. the footsteps halted. The silence that followed was a physical pressure pushing in on her eardrums. It was the silence of held breath, of suspended animation. Then a new sound, a faint, metallic scrape. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the door. The porcelain doorknob, cold and white, began to turn. It didn't jiggle or rattle. It rotated with a smooth, terrifying purpose, the mechanism inside clicking softly, once, twice. She heard the deadbolt, which she knew she had thrown, slide back with a solid, unmistakable clunk of forged metal retracting into its housing. Released, the door drifted inward, swinging open a precise 6 inches. The black gap between the door and the frame was an absolute void, a slice of nothingness that seemed to suck the light and sound from the room. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into a taut, rubbery minute. "Hello." The word was a dry rustle, barely audible. Her body moved on autopilot, a marionette with trembling strings. She rose from the chair, the blanket falling to a heap on the floor, and took one hesitant step, then another, toward the open door. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She expected to see a figure, a shape, anything. She pushed the door open wider, the hinges groaning in protest. The hallway was desolate, empty. She scanned its length from the worn runner rug to the numbered doors, all shut tight. Her gaze dropped, and there they were. A line of wet footprints, starting precisely at her welcome mat and leading into her home. They were large, masculine, filled with the details of worn-down boot trades. Water was already beginning to pool in the deepest impressions, shimmering like black oil in the lamplight. Her eyes followed their path, a cold dread solidifying in her stomach. They didn't lead toward her kitchenette or her bathroom. They marched a straight, unwavering path to a single destination, the large, full-length leaning mirror propped against the wall between 2 towers of sealed boxes. A wave of cold air washed over her, so sudden and localized it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. It raised the fine hairs on her arms and the back of her neck. Her pulse hammered in her temples. She was compelled to look, her head turning slowly, mechanically, toward the mirror's silvered surface. It reflected the room behind her, the open door, the rainy window, her chair. And there, standing just behind her right shoulder, was a figure. It was tall and wore a dark, heavy coat that dripped rainwater onto her floor, though the figure in the reflection was the only source of the water. His face was gaunt, pale as a grub, with deep sockets where his eyes should be. But she could see them nonetheless, dark, depthless pits that held a terrifying awareness. And his mouth was curved into a smile. It was not a smile of joy or menace, but of profound, unsettling satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who had traveled a very long way and was finally exactly where they were meant to be. His reflected eyes were locked on hers, seeing her, knowing her, in a way that felt more intimate than any touch. A sound, half gasp, half scream, tore from her throat. She spun around, a violent, whipping motion that sent her off balance, her shoulder crashing into a stack of boxes. They teetered and fell, scattering books and kitchenware across the floor with a deafening clatter. Her eyes scanned the space, wild and desperate. There was no one. The spot where the figure had stood was empty. The air was still and cold. There was no sound of retreating footsteps, no displacement of air, no lingering presence except for the crushing, absolute emptiness. She whipped her head back to the mirror, her own reflection a mask of pure terror, her hand flying to her mouth. She was alone. The smiling man was gone, but the evidence remained. The wet footprints, glistening and real, led to the mirror and ended there. The puddle at the base of the mirror was still spreading, a dark stain seeping into the wood. Since that Halloween night, Lila has never, not once, walked through the hallway of her Logan Square apartment with the lights off again. She paid for the installation of the blinding LED fixture herself, and it now burns day and night, a silent sentinel against the gloom. The wet footprints eventually dried, leaving behind faint, ghostly outlines of salt and city grime that she scrubbed away on her hands and knees until her knuckles were raw. She told no one. The story was too fragile, too insane. But the memory of that smile is now a part of her, a cold stone lodged in her gut. She keeps the mirror, unable to muster the courage to discard it, but she has draped it with a thick, black bedsheet. Now, every time she enters or leaves her apartment, her body is rigid, her keys clutched like a weapon. Her eyes are forever darting, scanning the sterile, overlit hallway, not for what is there, but for what the light might be hiding in the sharp, black shadows it creates. The space